This is David Nang Huang Wang. You've probably never heard of him, but all you pretty much need to know right now is that his contributions to the wider social and cultural implications of what Chinatown represents is often overlooked, but don't worry, we'll come back to him. This is Melbourne. As of 2015, it is the world's most livable city for the 5th consecutive year running, according to The Economist. This city is home to, among other things, the MCG, Federation Square, Flinders Street Station, the world's largest urban tram network, and the kind of horrifying lunar park, and terrible, terrible weather. Despite the terrible weather, 4 million ethnically and culturally diverse people call this sprawling city and its surrounding area home. At the eastern end of Little Bourke Street lies Melbourne's Chinatown, one of the longest continuous Chinese settlements in the world. On the street are respected restaurants, businesses, and cultural attractions. The Chinese are an accepted part of Melbourne's multicultural centre, and Chinatown is now one of Melbourne's largest tourist attractions. But this wasn't always the case. See, a little over 100 years ago, Australia was a very different place. Anti-Chinese sentiment during the gold rushes in Australia's desire to uphold a White Australia led to a series of laws referred to as the White Australia Policy in 1901. Racism as a social construction was institutionalised into the fabric of Australia's birth with the Information Dictation Test and the Immigration Restriction Act. The Chinatown of this era was markedly different from that of later incarnations, as it was known as more of a slum built in the waning years of the gold rush with opium dens, brothels, and boarding houses, despite the construction of a zone of lodging houses, provision stores, butchers, and manufacturing centres to serve residential and upcountry Chinese settlers who engaged in business with white Australians. By the 1930s, the policy was still upheld, and Chinatown remained a marginal community, yet it thrived from the popularity of its restaurants among university students and the Melbourne community. War tends to bring about the most amount of change, good or otherwise. Post-war Australia in the 1940s altered much of the government's policies on immigration. Reforms to discriminatory immigration, nationality laws, and wide-ranging changes to trade union rules and work practices allowed greater intakes of Chinese people. And although racism specifically towards Asians was high because of the war, Chinatown remained a culturally significant part of Melbourne. Chinatown in the 1960s was marked by a boom in tourism from a governmental shift to cultural pluralism and the appearance of a large number of Chinese businesses around the area. From 1970, the Melbourne City Council pushed the City Council to radically redevelop the Little Bourke Street and Chinatown area in an effort to reshape the perception of Chinese and increase the wealth of the ward. This led to the construction of the archways as part of the first phase of redevelopment in the 1970s. Despite mixed reaction, the second phase of redevelopment commenced in 1984. During the Vietnam War, the Whitlam government adopted a non-discriminatory immigration policy, and the Fraser government allowed a substantial intake of Asian refugees and immigrants. These acts by Whitlam and Fraser changed the very nature of Australia and began a policy of multiculturalism in Australia that exists even now. The policy ultimately came to an end in 1973, and Australian cities by about 1975 took on a paradigm of cultural pluralism, and symbols of ethnic diversity became objects of civic pride. Chinatown became such a symbol in the new multicultural Australia. And to this day, Chinatown has remained a popular hub for business, cuisine, and tourism. So that is a very brief rundown of Chinatown's history and the effect of the White Australia policy on it. Now, remember the councillor I just mentioned that pushed the City Council to redevelop Chinatown? Well, that was David Wang. He was a military liaison to Australia during the Second World War, where he met his wife Mabel and gained a business residency permit in 1948. In 1950, he opened a furniture store in Chinatown, and by the 1960s, his business had grown so rapidly that he had become a leading figurehead of the Chinese community, known as the Father of Chinatown. Now, in the context of the discrimination inherent in the White Australia policy, the election or even consideration of a foreign Asian man as a candidate to the council seat of Melbourne would be an unthinkable testament to the people's waning perception of discrimination. Incidentally, that's exactly what happened, and David would be elected to council in 1969. Now, David by the time of his election was a very popular entrepreneur who wanted to extend shopping hours in the city, revitalise Melbourne's nightlife, and redevelop Chinatown, which has slowly been declining in appearance despite its popularity. His proposal for Chinatown's redevelopment had existed since 1960, following the success of San Francisco's Chinatown remodeling and involved renovating buildings and businesses, often with his own money. The Chinatown project gained traction in the 1970s, and it was in David's mind a statement to the Australians that the area was no longer the slum it was 100 years ago, and could be more than it appeared if allowed to prosper economically and as a tourist attraction. Much of this coincided with the government pushing for multiculturalism and an increase in tourism. David's push for redevelopment attracted the attention of the Premier Rupert Hammer and the Mayor of Melbourne, Ron Walker, both of whom would in 1975 inject $500,000 into the project, making it the, quote, first joint venture into tourist development, end quote. In a 1975 letter requesting further state support from the Minister of Tourism and Development, Murray Byron, Mayor Walker stated, quote, Chinatown is backed by this council to the hilt, end quote. Thus the first stage of redevelopment commenced. Aside from union problems during construction, the project was not without opposition, with many people believing that the development of an ethnic quarter would render it into a racial curiosity, rather than a tourist attraction, in turn becoming a sideshow. However, David Wang believed that redevelopment would promote China's 5,000-year-old culture in a time of growing multiculturalism. The Premier agreed, stating to the Victoria Legislative Assembly that redevelopment would, quote, give recognition to the Chinese community in the form of a Chinese village, end quote. He told The Age in 1976 he wanted to transform the city's eyesores into sights for sore eyes, with Chinatown being a special project, believing that tourists would bypass Melbourne entirely, stating again to The Age, quote, at present large numbers of them fly here, look around for a couple of days, decide there's nothing much to do in Melbourne, and fly out again for Sydney, end quote. In August 1970, 60 archways to Little Bourke Street were erected. Lanterns and lighting were added to the aesthetic, and over the next few years the economy and tourism in this area boomed as the street became an even more popular local and tourist destination. David's dream of a revitalized Chinatown had only just begun, and in his mind had a long way to go. Yet it would ultimately be cut short. At a New Year's function on 31st of December 1977, he suffered a heart attack and died in hospital the following day. He died with the knowledge that Melbourne was becoming more cosmopolitan, and that the respect and tolerance shown by Australian youths towards other cultures would further integrate multiculturalism into society. The second stage of Chinatown's redevelopment was devised in 1983 by the City Council and involved the reconstruction of the arches and much of the buildings and fixtures beginning in 1984, as well as the construction of the Chinese Museum in 1985. This stage of the redevelopment was a symbol of respect to both David Wang, the Chinese who was seen as an important part of Melbourne, and a contribution to the Australian idea of multiculturalism, according to a broadsheet publication from the City of Melbourne. Redeveloping Chinatown represented a physical shift to multiculturalism as a political idea, as well as new liberal perceptions of race. David Wang's push for redevelopment meant that the Chinese could be recognised as an important part of Melbourne's history and development, that they could be more than a simple enclave and curiosity. Little Bourke Street in Chinatown had their stories about space. Despite the understandable fear of redevelopment bringing with it concerns of Chinatown becoming an ethnic curiosity and therefore exacerbate discrimination, I would argue that it was a necessary and progressive step to say that the Chinese were here and have always been a part of Melbourne, just as long as white Australians. Nowadays, racism towards the Chinese exists in lesser forms, and multiculturalism sometimes takes a step backwards, especially in the way we deal with refugees, immigrants, and internal racism. I think that will definitely one day be better, but if you can take anything away from this, take the fact that 100 years ago Chinatown was a slum filled with tents, ragged houses, and opium dens. Today, Little Bourke Street is one of the most popular destinations for both Australians and Chinese. Chinatown is a place of business, culture, and food, and we have people like David Wang, Rupert Hammer, Mayor Walker, and the Australian people to thank for both redeveloping Chinatown and pushing us into a multicultural era. I like to think that the arches stand as a monument to what can be achieved once we get past constructed concepts of race and ethnicity in our daily lives, but if nothing else, they stand as a symbol of Chinese acceptance and cultural progress.